The Highlands, Scotland's largest whisky-producing region. Ardmore Distillery has been crafting a single malt Scotch for over a century.
I'm now going to open up the oldest cask we have in the warehouse, which is 46 years old.
Its trademark, a smoky aroma.
The peat smoke at the side of my mouth has become almost chewy. If you can imagine a kind of licorice root kind of flavour rather than the barbecue peat smoke.
An unmistakable perfume derived from the burning of peat. The soy-like substance formed by decomposing vegetation is used to dry the malted barley. Combine with water and yeast, let it ferment for at least 40 hours, and you get a beer-like brew ready to be distilled. A recipe that has remained nearly unchanged for hundreds of years.
I would say that peat is one of the iconic emblems of Scotch whisky. To remove peat would to remove one of the fundamental building blocks of our unique reputation, of our character, and our unique identity.
Whether peat should remain a crucial component has become a burning issue in the industry, pitting tradition against environmental concerns. 50 kilometers north of Ardmore, we visit a former extraction site. Andrew McBride was hired by Suntory Global Spirits to oversee its restoration.
Today, the bog is what we would call degraded bog, where we have quite a lot of exposed peat. This should be green from one edge to the other, so you shouldn't actually see the black at all.
This is what harvesting looked like. For over 50 years, peat was dug out and cut into bricks. Originally, the bog was 3 meters high. There's now 20 centimeters of peat left. When damaged, peat bogs can pose a serious climate risk.
When peat becomes exposed, the peat actually starts to break down, and the carbon from the peat goes back into the atmosphere or goes into the water and runs off.
Peatlands are, in fact, one of the most effective carbon sinks we have. They're formed by the accumulation of dead vegetation over thousands of years, trapping along the way the CO2 that living plants had captured from the air. Scottish wetlands store the equivalent of 140 years' worth of Scotland's annual emissions. And to activate their carbon-capturing powers, they need plants.
What we have covering the exposed peat is what we call sphagnum moss, the super plant that is a builder of bogs and peat, and the moss is very good at colonizing where the water is actually consistent, a consistent level.
Just like a hair transplant, he says, samples of sphagnum moss will be planted across artificial ponds of water, restoring the bog to its former green glory. Suntory Global Spirits is providing all the funding for this project. The company aims to restore as much peat as it takes out by 2030.
We are promising in the future that there will be at least as much peat. It is very much so a business decision to do the right thing from a sustainability point of view.
But distilleries are not the only ones to rely on peat. It's also used in potting mixes and compost, making the horticultural sector the largest contributor to peat extraction. Add to that the effects of climate change, and a whopping 80% of Scottish peatlands are now considered degraded. The government is even mulling a ban on the sale of peat and has already committed to restoring 250,000 hectares in the next 5 years. When restored, peat bogs like this one can become crucial allies in our fight against climate change. Although they cover just 3% of the global land surface, they store twice as much carbon as all of the world's forests. The moss of Rothiemay used to provide peat to a local distillery. It's now been 10 years since its restoration.
We call this the bounce test. You bounce up and down. You can't do this on a dry bog.
Michael Billett has dedicated his life to studying peat. He says Rothieme is proof that conservation efforts can work.
A peat forms about 1 millimetre a year. It's probably forming faster here.
Despite a dry year, it's in good shape.
And this is really beautiful peat. We've got the vegetation growing on the top. Without it, the peat would blow away. And this is full of water, which is one of the other really important functions of a peat bog. It's a huge store of water.
By holding water, peatlands can reduce flooding downstream. They're also a hotspot for biodiversity. The retired professor believes this bog to be 4 meters deep and 6,000 years old, a living witness to the profound impacts of human activities.
That report from Valerie DeCamp and our Down to Earth team. Valerie joins me now on the set. Valerie, the big question here is, how bad is this going to be for Scottish whiskey lovers?
Well, some observers have made the alarming suggestion that peated whiskey could one day disappear in the near future if a ban on the sale of peat comes into effect. That seems very unlikely. If anything, peat bogs are way more at risk than whiskey. But questions have emerged. Can we keep on using peat in the same way that the whiskey industry has done for so many years? In England, a ban on products containing peat had been announced in 2022. It has since been delayed. The Scottish government also launched its own consultation, with this idea of potentially putting in place a ban on the sale of peat. So things are brewing, especially when you put in the balance whiskey and, the climate emergency.
Can you still make whiskey without peat?
Well, there's a misconception that all whiskey is peated, but many, there are many unpeated whiskeys from Scotland as well. So peated whiskeys, as you can see here, have that very bold, smoky flavor. But you also have unpeated whiskey, meaning that peat was not used to dry the malted barley, and so it's a lot lighter, sweeter, fruiter, and again, it's not all black and white. It's not just peated and unpeated. There's another category, which is blended Scotch, so a blend of single malt and grain mixes so you have a mix of potentially peated and unpeated. Now, what's interesting is that originally all Scotch was peated because peat was the only source of fuel available back in the day. And then as railways expanded, coal became more accessible, and so many distilleries decided to give up on peat. The question now you're going to say, so why do some distilleries keep using peat? Well, it's because that was the traditional method, and so it became their identity. It really became what set Scotch whiskey apart from other whiskeys. And as a matter of fact, Scotland's most famous whiskeys are peated.
So I'm assuming that if one day the industry has to completely let go of peat, the economic stakes would be very high.
The industry has made it very clear that a ban on peat would have major consequences for them. So we know that 43 bottles of Scotch whiskey are exported every second to markets all over the world. That, according to the Scotch Whisky Association, more than 41,000 people are employed in the Scotch whisky industry in Scotland alone, and all Scottish whisky sold worldwide generates about £4.4 billion for the UK economy. So it is a massive, massive business. In the government consultation launched in 2023 by the Scottish government, the Scotch Whisky Association, when asked if they could continue making whiskey without peat, they said, well, the majority of Scotch whiskey could not be produced without peat, and this would have major consequences, job losses in Scotland as a result.
So given all of that, is there any viable alternative to peat, or is restoration really the only way forward?
Well, if peat is used to create smoke, then you might say, well, can we burn something else to create, smoke and give whiskey that distinctive aroma? That would be a reasonable ask. The industry and industry observers say that peat is so unique that it can't easily be replicated, that unique flavor. Purists might even say that each bog gives its own aroma to whiskey. In the same way that, the French will say that, different kinds of soil will give a different kind of wine depending on the region. Now, some distilleries would like to use other materials to provide that smoke, but where it gets tricky is that there are rules saying that if you want to smoke, you need peat. You can't use another material. So rules essentially would have to change if we want an alternative. So what about restoration efforts and restoration efforts by the whiskey industry, which is what we saw in our report? Critics might say that it's a form of offsetting, in the same way that some polluting companies might say, we will continue to generate emissions, but we will plant trees in order to compensate for our emissions. But in the end, you're not essentially limiting, you're not changing your way. So critics would say, well, this is just business as usual. But if you take a more pragmatic approach, you could also argue that you have the whiskey industry, a multi-billion-dollar industry willing to invest in restoration. So they have the money to do it. And peat bogs can only benefit from restoration. There's no doubt about that. And in a report, what's also interesting is that this example in particular, when the project is over, the land will be left untouched. So it's not about restoring and then we're going to come back later and keep on digging peat. So it is the only solution, at least that we have for now, if we don't have an alternative for peat.
All right, Valerie, thanks for that. Valerie DeCamp with that look at Scotch whisky and its environmental impact. Thanks to you for watching France 24. Stay with us.